Hello, welcome back. It's time to do some rookie ranks, I think. So we're going to look at the top 9 prospects in the 2022 class at the wide receiver position from a production nerdy stat sheet. Okay, so the graphs on the screen are mostly so you don't have to stare at my face in big, because no one wants that. I get that you're not getting much from the graphs, and probably I didn't make the text big enough, but yeah, that's where we're at. Number 1 in the class so far, and there's really not much of a question. If there is a question, reevaluate the process a little bit. Treylon Bourque in the 22 wide receiver class, assuming these players all declare, by the way. I don't even know. I just kind of jumped right into the stats. Treylon Bourque stands out above the rest. He's the one player in this class that would have easily fit into the last 2 classes in the top tier. He's the only player in the wide receiver position for this class so far that I've seen, and I've pretty much run through all of them, at least all the ones DLF has ages for, or dates of birth, which is kind of how I profile. He just stands out head and shoulders in a tier of his own. He's the only one in the first tier for me at this position this year. It's important to notice that, or know, or accept, or hear me say that just because players profile well doesn't mean they're the best player in the class. I'm not projecting levels even. I'm not even saying this is AJ Brown or this is, Robbie Anderson. There's a discrepancy between how well players played in college and how well they're going to play in the NFL that isn't always solved by the difference between their college production. But if you're asking who compares best or better or the most like the most productive players in the NFL for fantasy, not for real NFL type stuff, Treylon Bourque just compares head and shoulders better than everyone else in the class. I mean, he broke out at age 20 at a 20 and a 30% threshold, which isn't going to set the BOA or the breakout age truthers alight. Even at the 30% threshold, 20 is just kind of good. It is very good. It's very good to have 30% of the team's receiving offense at the age of 20 years old. But if even a cursory glance at some of his other stats to see how he put those seasons together shows you that he's just head and shoulders. Now, this graph is actually one way of representing a lot of the stuff the nerds are going to be talking about this offseason. Treylon Bourque isn't just above the average for successful players in the NFL. Now, the little orange line on the graph represents players that have had at least one top 36 type season, 150 points. I recently updated it to players that have had a top 24 season in the NFL since 2009 or so, and that's the average of their production at each age, and it's kind of a main look into how productive they were if we're comparing apples to apples. Now, top 24 season actually isn't that much different than the top 36 line because this stuff isn't exponential. It's not like you get 30% and you're 10% better than the player who got 20% at age 20. It's more about it's about a comparison. Are you following similar patterns, excelling over other players in college in terms of the production and the market share and the whole swath, the share of the pie that you co-opted or created for yourself on that team. Now, the graph itself is about yards per team pass attempt. Yards per route run or route data is really interesting, but for college it's not publicly available. I just use per team pass attempt, and it works relatively well. I haven't seen any great research or testing to prove that using routes or targets works any better than yards per route run. I know people are beginning to become more comfortable with market share of yards per team and passing attempt. I just like to look at the raw number because I can compare it directly to a stat that we use for NFL analysis, and I know it to be good and useful and predictive, or one of the most predictive stats for how a player is going to do when they enter the NFL. That little section was just for the nerds who were wondering about all the other stats. It's just a representation of the best stat I got that really competes with anything else and mapped onto his age. And you can see he wasn't just over the average at age 20 and 21. He thrashed the average. Now, again, that doesn't mean you're 20 times better than everyone who's only over the average once, because this stuff isn't exponential. For example, the dots at the very top, which you probably can't see because it's so far up and so faded, is Demaryius Thomas. Definitely one of the best wide receiver prospects we've seen since 2009, but his production was exponentially greater because he was playing at such an exponentially slower, lower conference, and he just dominated the entire offensive scheme for the times he was in college because he was such a great wide receiver. Now, adjusting for context through experience or age or team can give you an insight into how well these players are playing within context, but comparing those adjustments to each other tends to result in less signal, which is why I just like to adjust it by the age or compare it to apples, how much production per team attempt a player is garnering for their individual offenses and compare it to each other, because it tends to be a fairer comparison than if we make the team adjustments and then compare them to each other, even based on age or team year or anything else. Other people's mileage may vary, but I find this to be the best look. So I'm using Treylon Bourque because there's really not much else to say. You want a player that compares well to the most productive players in college that have ever declared for the NFL since 2009, since 2000, since whenever. It's Treylon Bourque. And no one else is close to this. At 3 yards per team pass attempt, which he did twice in both of his last 2 years, that's as good a number as you pretty much see, unless you're Demaryius Thomas, that uniquely high-level, talented player playing in such a quote-unquote lower conference, but also a team that was fully willing to basically give over that entire offense to him, which isn't always true. One of the exceptions to these production trends is Michael Thomas, one of the most productive wide receivers we've seen in recent years, who co-opted a large share of an NFL offense and produced mass amounts of fantasy points. He played at Ohio State, and the offense just does not seem to have been willing to utilize his skill set, and he actually looked overproductive compared to past players. Now, there are actually about 5, 6, depending on how generous you want to give to the outlier category. Over the last 20 years, there's about 7 different examples of players that genuinely profile as just low productive players, even in their situations when compared to past players. I've actually written them all up in the DLF article, the outliers, because we use that word a lot, but I don't think a lot of it's a term we slap on a player we just don't find fits our narrative very often. But if you actually know what an outlier looks like, it's the ones that don't have something in common when all the others do. And like I said, there's about 7 different examples if you're a little generous with it, but most players show up on this type of analysis of having been overly productive within their situation based on how they were playing. And again, Treylon Bourque compares best to the best of them. I haven't dug into his skill set, where he plays, where he's likely to play, where he's likely to be drafted. I do know that Treylon Bourque is coming from the SEC West, which is drafted into the NFL in the top 3 rounds for 11.4% of all players since 2009 in the first 3 rounds at that position have come from the SEC West. It's a very popular conference, and he played for Arkansas. Don't know if that matters to the NFL at all, to be honest, because I haven't looked at it through a team level, but there's a pretty high expectation that Treylon Bourque is going to be high drafted. He's as productive as anyone that you could like. BMI or BOA Twitter, or all the initial Twitters aside, Treylon Bourque is it. It's what a good prospect looks like, and he's the one clear-cut example we have in this class. Could he fail? Sure. Okay, so wide receiver 2 in this class, hoping to skip over a lot of the explanation I just gave with Bourque. For me right now, it's Chris Olave. Someone taught me how to say that name, I'm not going to lie. Did not jump off the page at me. This is his graph, yards per team attempt, matched against the average of players that have had a top 24 season in the NFL. I mean, players should definitely not listen to fantasy analysts about anything, but I would say his profile was looking much better if you take off that last year where he drops once again below the average. Now again, where this stuff isn't exponential, and you can see through all the dots behind there, plenty of players have gone on to be really productive in the NFL for fantasy and been below their age curve in their last year or at age 21. It happens. Now, having had a lot of experience looking at these graphs and reading the numbers, I can tell you it's not great that we saw a dip in production in that last year. But there isn't a connection to degrading in your final year or your age 21 year and then not producing in the NFL. So while it's uncomfortable a little bit for me, because you'd like it to be perfect, like Treylon Bourque, I'm really not concerned the fact he's suffered a last year dip. He's over the age curve in the last 2 years. At age 20, much like Treylon Bourque, he's exponentially above their age curve with a 3.7 yards per team pass attempt. It's very good. In fact, because of another player I'm going to rank in this class, I think there's an explanation for what happened in at age 21. And while, again, it doesn't mean he wasn't less productive than he should have been last year, he was. But we do have some trends when good players are on the same team together. They cannot limit each other's potential, but they do limit each other's ceiling a little bit, and so that's not what this is. He was legitimately less productive than we would expect when he returned to college last year, but again, the only player who doesn't have something like that on his profile this year is Treylon Bourque, and so Olave has the smallest of small little dents in the profile, as it were, that isn't exactly what you'd like to see. So yeah, I'm not gonna disregard what he did for the rest of his career just because last year wasn't exactly perfect. Yeah, this is true for his market share as well. I'm looking over my notes because I feel like there must be something else to say about Olave. No, that's basically it. That's all I've got for you on a first look. It's good. Last year's a little concerning, but overall this is a very good player, and I'm not going to think he's worse now just because last year he struggled a little bit, especially since the age 19 and 20. He was as good as we normally can hope to have across most profiles. So Olave, for me, fits in as a first player in Tier 2. There's a little concern there. Will he get drafted? Where will he get drafted? Where would he play? And obviously we like to see lots more information about these players, not just the numbers, not just their production. I want to hear from a lot of other people, but first glance, Olave fits in at 2 for me, but it's a different kind of tier from Treylon Bourque overall. Coming from the Big Ten East, which has a slow drafted rate, like 4.4% of players drafted in the NFL since 2009, and the first 3 rounds have come from the Big Ten East. Ohio State, which I mentioned earlier with Michael Thomas, has been known to not give over their offense to some great players that have passed through there, not just Michael Thomas, but Terry McLaurin. 2 of those 7 exceptions come from that same team in the exact same era, which is interesting, but probably not a feature of the team we can ascribe to every other player. And since Olave did fairly well anyway, it's fine. And at least we know the team is willing to at least invest some draft capital in the form of Terry McLaurin being a later round pick, or Michael Thomas being a very high drafted player going on to have great success with Drew Brees. Yeah, overall, I'm not too worried about Olave, and he fits in as wide receiver 2 for me in this class. Number 3, I need drops. I still need drops. Yeah, Garrett Wilson fits in as a wide receiver 3 for me in this class, in the same tier as Olave. We're looking at a solid tier 2 prospect in the 2022 class. Garrett Wilson is one of the reasons I'm willing to squint a little bit at Chris Olave's last year, because Wilson really took off after the age of 19, as you can see by the graph. By the time he hits 19 is when he starts playing, or at least when he starts recording stats, as far as I know, that are significant enough over the game threshold they actually start tracking him. His second year, he went off exponentially. Remember, that's when Chris Olave is doing pretty well, with 3.2 yards per team pass attempt. Again, anything over 3 is actually eyebrow raising, especially at a decent school in a decent conference like Ohio State. I don't know what makes a good college team, but I know good players have come from there, so I assume it's relatively competitive. And last year he saw a dip as well, which again kind of matches up to what Olave did, but he is closer to the age line. Again, you can see how some of this stuff can become navel-gazing, like is he close enough? Either way, I can say that both were underperforming in a slightly strange year, because we're still going through a lot just in real life right now, and colleges are going through a lot as well, so that might explain there's a lot of squinting at 2021-2022 production because of the pandemic and the restrictions placed on a lot of schools as well, so that could feature into it. And the fact both co-opted large shares of this offense and had performed very well, exceptionally well the year before, and both saw a dip this year while playing together on the same team, at a team that has some level of history of reducing the level of commitment to some of its best players, at least at the receiving game. Garrett Wilson looks like an explanation for some of Olave's dips last year, and also himself looks like a relatively decent prospect. I'm putting him in at 2 in the same tier as Olave, so I need to learn lots more about them in order to separate them out for draft capital, and the draft, obviously, for all of these players is going to determine a lot. If any of these guys are Tyler Johnson and gets drafted in the 6th round instead of the first 3 rounds, like we kind of expected for Tyler Johnson, that's kind of a dramatic effect on how well he profiles, or how likely he is to produce fantasy points in the NFL, obviously. But for right now, Wilson looks like a really solid profile, especially playing as a 2 behind another player who is doing exceptionally well, Chris Olave. That for me gives them a little extra tick and lets me squint at some of the off numbers. Again, breakout age Twitter is not going to like these guys because both have slightly elevated breakout ages where you see their age curves take an extra year to play off, and where Garrett Wilson, just because aware of it, his date of birth falls, actually starts playing at the age of 19 instead of the age of 18, which, you know, is the golden breakout age of Twitter. Either way, I think Wilson looks like a exponentially productive player at a team that has reduced good players before, and yet it was no problem for either Olave or Wilson. So I think both look pretty good. To be honest, tier 2 prospects, I'm really interested to see where they go in the draft and learn a lot more about them. I don't know how I'm going to do the transitions for this, because switching over the grass just, you know, it's not content, so I do a fade. Woo, woo. Did it work? I don't know. George Pickens is my least favorite so far. Like Olave and Wilson, I've got stuff to talk about, but I honestly think both look like really good players. George Pickens comes up because, one, he's playing in one of those higher drafted conferences that we can have pretty decent expectations that the NFL is going to be aware of him and going to be looking where they want to draft him instead of whether he'll be discovered to be drafted. Playing in the SEC East, about 10% of players since 2009 have been drafted from the SEC East. He's playing at Georgia as well. Even I know that's a very well-known school. The NFL is aware of those players and probably deciding where rather than if they should be interested in the top prospects from those schools. And as for a receiver from Georgia, George Pickens is a pretty good example of Georgia receivers. Now, he's not the best Georgia's ever had to offer, but he was over the age curve in both of his first 2 years at age 18 and 19. You've got to give him that. He played as well as good prospects that have gone on to do well for fantasy in the NFL have ever done through those first 2 ages in Georgia, which has a fairly high expectation of production as it is. All 3 players, or four players now, or 4 players I've looked at have beaten the age curves overall in terms of their conference average, their age average, and their experience average, which I'm thinking of calling coffee, but that's a story for another day. The next guy I have is probably someone I have the most draft concerns with, and this enters a separate tier. Now, the players in this tier I probably like better in terms of a production standpoint for various reasons, just things I've learned to track, elements of profile I like to see. But they have much more draft concerns than the solid profiles who match well with their production profiles that I'm going to talk about in this tier. But also, this tier has less expectation of draft capital. David Bell, I think, especially once, and we're going to talk about his age 19 season here in a little bit, that little yellow dot that's missing, is coming from the Big Ten West. And I know not everyone distinguishes between the West and the Eastern conferences, but I do, okay? Just like, live with that, I guess. He's also coming from Purdue, and I am no stranger to absolutely loving players from Purdue, only to see them not quite do what I hoped, to be honest. Wandel Moore is the latest, but I actually think he had one of the better rookie seasons that we've seen, especially from Purdue in the NFL this year. David Bell actually, I think, profiles a little bit better than than Wandel Moore as a receiver. And I profiled Wandel Moore as a receiver, even though now he's getting talked about as, you know, a potential gadget player or whatever. I don't think so, but that's a conversation for another day. And I think David Bell was doing slightly better in some ways than Wandel Moore, with a slightly larger sample size, because one of the problems with Moore was we basically had one healthy season. But overall, yeah, coming from Purdue, the Big Ten West, literal 0% drafted rate. Like, it's Wandel Moore. He's the guy that got draft capital in the first 3 rounds from this class, but where that's a recent class, it's not factored into draft rate. Some teams just have those kind of histories. You get familiar with them the more you look at them. Now, David Bell does break both the conference, the experience, and the age curve. As you can see from his graph here, it's kind of a good description of the way all his production would look if you mapped any particular stat onto an average of past players at different ages. This is kind of what he looks like. There's no great per game, late breakout, any of the other little red flags we've learned to look at. All his stats look decently above the average. Now, that missing year there, 19, is because the team actually in the Big Ten West suffered significant loss of season because of, you know, stuff that's going on, and so they played so few games that no player played enough games. I actually included them in most of my stat profiles because I found if you can't get over 6 games played, then the sample size is too noisy. It actually can lie to you more often than it will tell you the truth. And An example of that is it's a lot easier to hit one free throw. I can, in basketball, right? That's a basketball thing. I could probably get the ball in the net once, and if I do it once, just leave it there, I look like I'm 100% accurate. Ask me to throw it twice, though, and it's going to drop to 50%. Ask me to throw it 10 times, it's going to drop to 10%. The more times you see a thing play out, the more confident you can be at how well that performance is and will maintain. And where Purdue just didn't play a lot of games in age 19, I basically just write off the season. Here's the thing, though, his other years actually back up what happened in that shortened season, and that shortened season was pretty much one of the best seasons that any of the players in this class had, including Bourque's. It's just kind of in this missing season. And again, just having one season as good as Bourque's wouldn't make him better than Bourque's, especially coming from Purdue, but it is noticeable to me that in this shortened season, a very common breakout year, by the way, Bell broke out a little before that. He hit a 30% threshold for the team's overall production. That's an age 19 breakout age at the 30% threshold. Yay, breakout age Twitter can finally be happy with me. This is not a class that's going to make breakout age Twitter happy. It's just not. But the only player to break out at a 30% threshold in this class is David Bell. And it's in this missing season because they played less than 6 games for the whole season. And again, I'm not putting it on the graph, I'm just letting you know. And the fact that his other years kind of back up that level of production, his yards per team attempt is stably, significantly high throughout the 2 seasons at age 18 and age 20 we see, where he played over 8 games, I think is actually the threshold I learned. It's real interesting to me that the one guy who managed to hit a really impressive breakout age of that 30% threshold, that's the kind of thing where breakout age can help identify. It's an identifier stat, not a profiling stat. It's really interesting to me that he may be missed, especially coming from Purdue with lower expectations of draft capital. It's really interesting. So, Wandel Robinson. Again, remember this third tier, has significant draft concerns. And Wandel Robinson is going to get tagged with like the next, the next Curtis Samuel, or the next Deebo Samuel, or a lot of them are called Samuel. Or the next Rondell Moore. There you go. I don't know about all of that. I do like that the NFL is experimenting more with a willingness to give players roles that they excel at, rather than trying to create them into a role that they want to exist. But I think that's too narrativizing. I will say that Wandel Robinson played running back initially. He converted to wide receiver, specifically in his last year. You see him pop off the chart there, well above the average. That's the year he was playing straight up wide receiver. That's cool. The fact that as a running back, playing for a lower team, I actually think he moved in to the conference he's going to be drafted on. He was actually playing at running back. Before that, I can't read my own notes. Here we go. Yeah, he was playing at Nebraska the first 2 years, where he was getting like 70, 80 rushing attempts, playing mostly running back. And then he elevates the SEC East, 10% drafted rate that we talked about earlier, playing at Kentucky. Yay, Kentucky, I live in Kentucky. But a lesser NFL scouted team at least. But still, it's a conference that they're paying attention to. They're not necessarily looking to draft Kentucky players. They're not deciding where, they're more deciding if. But in that last year, he was still significantly productive as a wide receiver. This isn't a converted running back. This is a player who's playing a large receiving role as a kind of a hybrid running back, and then moved much more into the pure receiving game when he elevated to a higher conference. And when he elevated, so ideally or theoretically it's harder to produce as a receiver, he did the best he's ever done with 3.64 yards per team pass attempt. That's the only other player than Bourque that we've seen hit that mark, apart from Olave in that 1 year as well, and then there was a big letdown. Whereas Wandel Robinson progresses into it, and he progresses into it despite a steep increase in, theoretically, ideally, the competition he was facing in the SEC East. I think that's highly impressive. I don't think we predict hybrid players or start calling them not a wide receiver, because wide receiver position itself is incredibly diverse from the way players play it. But that he has other elements to his game, that he is a utility player, or that he is a player with other skill sets that not every wide receiver comes with or develops, I don't think that's definitely not a bad thing, especially since he's capable of being a very productive player, even when the conference level is elevated. He's someone I'm really excited to see if the NFL pays attention to. Much like David Bell, that's this tier 3. Wandel Robinson, check him out. I think he's really interesting. Skye Moore. My production model absolutely loves Skye Moore. But here's the thing. He's from Western Michigan, the MAC West. This is one of the few teams I will actually know that off the top of my head. This is Corey Davis's team. Corey Davis's team has a habit of doing this. Now, no, Corey Davis is an NFL caliber player. Okay, let's ignore fantasy. He's held a roster on 2 different teams and been productive, or more productive than many first-round picks. Not necessarily for fantasy. He's barely scraped top 24 relevance, but he's an NFL caliber player, as most of these guys are going to actually end up being, so whether they're fantasy relevant. But Corey Davis is fringe fantasy relevant, arguably. So it's not like Western Michigan. Productive players at Western Michigan are just lies. They're not Isaiah Fords, but that was a lower drafted prospect. He's not Andy Isabella. There's another one. He was an incredibly productive player, went into the NFL with high draft capital, and so far we've seen nothing. So there's not a lot to back up that Western Michigan produces excessive stats. But yeah, it's okay to squint at him a little bit. Now, Skye Moore is epically productive, and you look at his entire profile. Like I say, my production model literally ranks him 1. I've pushed him down here into the 3rd tier because, again, Western Michigan, he gets drafted about 1.8% of the time for wide receivers drafted in the first 3 rounds since 2009. So they take Corey Davis's. Greg Jennings, I believe, is in the history of this team as well. Back in the day. Skye Moore's profile rests somewhere between the 2 of them, Greg Jennings and Corey Davis. He was epically productive in his situation, but we also know wide receivers can do that and not necessarily be carrying the full weight that production seems to indicate in terms of an ability to elevate it to the NFL. Drake London. We're entering another tier here. I forget what I called this one. Now, Drake London has significant production. Again, you can't see this graph very well, but he is excessively over the age curve at age 20 and not at age 18 who's directly on it. This is positive, right? So how do we pass this information? Is it partly because he sounds like he's a detective in a noir novel? Yeah, I'll give you that. I want him to go to the Colts, and I want him and Jack Doyle to team up and solve crimes together. But that's not why. He actually played, speaking of the Colts, on the same team as Michael Pittman did. Drake London, yeah, he plays Southern California in the Pac-12. 3% of players drafted into the NFL since 2009 come from that conference, so a little lower expectation in terms of draft capital already, but I think the NFL is largely aware of Southern California if a good player is on that team. That's why drafted rate doesn't always tell the full story. Now, again, he's playing on Michael Pittman's team and actually did better than Michael Pittman in terms of yards per team pass attempt and overall market share of the offense when Michael Pittman was not there. Drake London takes over, and he is technically a higher producer on a per attempt basis and takes over a higher share of the overall offense, which is impressive, especially considering what Michael Pittman did in the offense this year. Remember, he did take excessive amount of time to work into it for most players drafted that high, but there's no taking away what he did in 2021. That was a really good wide receiver season, as good a season as we can ever hope from anyone we're taking in a rookie draft, and Drake London had a similar, if not more productive season at the same college just a couple years later, so we're looking more apples to apples, and I actually think that's fairly interesting. He also was more productive than Amon-Ra, who also had a good year in 2021 as well. That's not to say that these players are the model, but the fact they've both played on the same team, so we compare their production to a player playing in almost the same situation, or much more the similar situation than most players when comparing one-on-one, is interesting that Drake London was doing better than both Amon-Ra and Michael Pittman in yards per team pass attempt. Again, this stuff isn't exponential. Being better doesn't mean you are better, but it does indicate to me that he's playing at a level that 2 players who have elevated to the NFL have actually able to produce stats, earn roles, and produce fantasy points while also playing at in a very similar situation. I think that's incredibly interesting for Drake London. The fact that he's over 3 yards per team pass attempt, which I don't think Pittman or Amon-Ra ever did, is interesting, but where we've got draft concerns on a lower competition level, it is fair to squint at. That's not a Treylon Bourque 3, okay? No, Treylon Bourque 3. It's not even a Chris Olave 3, but it is a good 3. Not everyone, like Pittman, who's an NFL player who just had a top 12 season, or Amon-Ra, who's now an NFL player who just had a top 24 season, on this team didn't hit 3 yards per team pass attempt. So it's easy to get there because two good players who just came from there, literally just came from there, didn't do it. That's why a lot of the expectations, when people look at my evaluations or look at my stat sheets, are like, why don't you just adjust it by team? It's because it literally doesn't work like that. Yeah, this is the 9th and final player of this class, I believe, that I'm interested in. It goes Drake London, right? Drake London, Justin Ross. I don't like Justin Ross. One, it sounds way too much like John Ross, and I'm triggered by those kind of things. But once I got over not being a child anymore, I went and looked, and yeah, his production doesn't look good. My model didn't like him as much as that matters. And part of the reason are these 2 seasons. He's age 19, then there's a break year, and 21, significantly below the average of successful players into the NFL. Both played over 6 games for both of them. That's why he gets a mark on the graph. So, end of story, right? Just having one good year to start with isn't it. But in terms of who else is left, and all the other 8 players that I've got ranked above him right now, and everyone else that I haven't ranked, Justin Ross stands out as the most interesting, with the highest potential for this production graph and his production to be hiding a lot more, and relative to conference as well. So what is it about Justin Ross? Is it just this age 18 season? Yeah, kinda, because I don't think we can judge the others ones. And again, this is a player with many more warts than every player I've mentioned so far. That's why he's ranking 9th, and I think he's a slightly different tier. I'm navel-gazing a little bit to see it, but again, familiarity with doing this a lot and looking over a lot of profiles and a little extra context I've been able to learn about them does seem to explain away every season after the age 18 season. We did it for Wandel Moore. I think we could be excited about him in a similar way. So he's a very different player, though. So what's Justin Ross? He's difficult for a start. Let me read from the notes. How about that? To start with, he began his career at age 18 playing with T. Higgins. That's the thing I forgot. Who's now #confirmed good in the NFL. But followed a very strong rookie year. He began to suffer from a medical condition that resulted in him missing his 3rd year. It was a medical condition called congenital fusion. And I'm not going to pretend to be a doctor right now, but I do know it involved a surgery around his spine, which does not sound like it would help you produce at football at the college level. You know? Like, that was probably hampering him in that age 19 season. I have to imagine. Anyway, he did play a full season. He skipped the next season to deal with that medical issue, and then he came back to this age 21. And it puts me in mind of Mike Williams, who got injured the year before he would have declared. He was meant maybe never to walk again, but had significant surgery, worked himself back, came back from one last college season, and we've seen him be good in the NFL. In fact, for a stretch in 2021, phenomenal, right? Capable NFL player who may have been derailed slightly, but an incredibly dangerous, and thank God he's okay, type injury. Justin Ross isn't Mike Williams and wasn't as productive for as long as Mike Williams before this happened to him, but we do know there's precedent for a player dropping in production and taking longer to develop, even in the NFL, because of something like this happening. Again, there's more narrative than it is stat-based analysis, but I like precedent, and I think that's fair game. I think that's a fair asterisk to put on these 2 below-average seasons. I don't think it's fair to judge the age 19 season, and on his return at age 21, he surely wasn't the same player, but he's just returned from a surgery, which, again, very scant, non-medical expert readings seem to be significantly dangerous surgery that he's just recovered from, so I'm not really willing to value his age 21 season as telling us something about how good he is compared to past prospects. I think those are 2 weird outlier years. The most logical, the best decision for me, trying to make decisions about fantasy football, to write off a player who excelled at age 18 with T. Higgins on the team, who we definitely know is good and could co-opt his own share, just because he returned to less fanfare than Amari Rodgers after having this significant medical surgery. So that's the next interesting player in the class, because I'm just ignoring all it apart from the age 18 season and noticing that he broke out for over the average of productive players in the NFL. And yards per team pass attempt, one of the best stats I found, or I have at least, with T. Higgins on the team. Now, good players on the same team don't reduce each other. It's not like it's harder to produce with T. Higgins. I actually imagine it's kind of easier because he's taking coverage, he's creating other opportunities for that team by catching passes other players wouldn't catch and creating yards other players wouldn't create. And so that actually makes it somewhat easier for the rest of your team. That's why good players elevate a team. However, they can limit your ceiling somewhat. And at age 18, your ceiling is significantly below this average threshold. And Justin Ross, not John, actually hit it and excelled above it. Yeah, ultimately what it comes down to is that is more interesting than anything else I found in the rest of the wide receivers I ranked so far. But, your mileage might vary. And all my stats where I make this graph from are in my database. Don't mean to make this sound boring, but I know everyone telling you where they can find their links and go find their content gets awfully dry on these videos and on Twitter and everywhere else. But it's just the truth. The whole reason I collect it is for my own work, just trying to get better at fantasy and make better hits. And over the years, people have asked about it. So it's literally just in a Google sheet, and it's pinned to my profile. I don't even know if you do it. Don't worry. I won't feel good if you do it. You don't give me nothing. I'm not getting money. I'm not getting clicks. I'm not recording views. I don't know. It's just because I like this stuff. I love being able to talk to you all about it regularly. And I've been told it's pretty good to have access to stats to make your own decisions, make your own models maybe, or just look up a number you're interested in. So it's all in there. So check out my pinned tweet. Again, don't worry. I'm not even paying myself for this promotion. That's where this data and all the other data I've got has come from. Use it. Good luck. God bless. If you're going to do anything, because it takes a lot of work to create, so I will put this. Check out the sources tab. There's about 6 names in there because I couldn't create it all by myself. Yeah, you don't have to give them money or nothing, but maybe follow them because all 6 of them are smarter than me. All 6 of them put in just as much work to create it. I just happen to host it and mash it all together in order to create a database. Hopefully we can also scan through and find some fun with data while playing fantasy football. So that's literally all I would ask from it. And if you like it at all, go check out the people in the sources tab, which also tells you where all the data is coming from. But go check out those friends of mine, because literally they get nothing else for it apart from I tell them I love them now and again, and that's not a good prize. So maybe check them out. I'd really appreciate it. And that, thanks. Let me know what you think of these players, who I'm missing from the top 9 prospects at wide receiver. You're wrong. I am right. No, I'm kidding. I'd love to know and appreciate it. Thanks very much. See you next time. Transition.